Fresh is better. That's the belief you absorbed before you were old enough to question it, reinforced every time you walk into a grocery store, and the quiet standard that makes you feel guilty when you reach for a frozen bag of vegetables at no frills instead of the ones stacked in the produce section. Fresh means quality. Fresh means nutrition. Fresh means you're doing right by your household. And you believe it. Most Canadians do. Walk into any Loblaws, Real Canadian Superstore or Metro and the produce section greets you at the entrance. That's not accidental. The lighting is warm and deliberate. The mist kicks on every few minutes. Chalkboard signs say, farm fresh and locally sourced. The whole setup is designed to feel honest, to feel like the right call. But here's what nobody standing in that produce section is going to tell you. That broccoli in your cart was likely harvested days, sometimes well over a week, before you touched it. It was picked in California or Mexico, packed into a refrigerated truck, transferred through a distribution warehouse, moved to a regional facility, delivered to the store's back room and arranged under those warm lights until you came along and assumed it was fresh. By the time it reaches your cutting board in Brampton, Regina, or Fredericton, a significant portion of its nutrients have already degraded. Research has consistently shown that fresh vegetables can lose up to 45% of specific vitamins, particularly vitamin C and folate, within just a few days of being harvested. Frozen produce is handled entirely differently. Vegetables headed for the freezer aisle are typically blanched and flash frozen within hours of being picked, right at peak ripeness, when nutrient content is at its highest. That process locks everything in. The vitamin C in a bag of frozen peas at your superstore can genuinely be higher than the fresh peas a few meters away in the produce bins. That is not a brand claim. That is documented, independently replicated food science. And yet the assumption holds, because fresh looks more alive, because frozen feels like settling, because the grocery industry constructed a hierarchy, and fresh won it entirely on presentation and emotion, not evidence. Now add the reality of what Canadian grocery shopping costs in 2025. A single red bell pepper at some Sobeys or Metro locations has crossed the $3 mark. Strawberries in January are effectively a luxury. Canadian households are among the highest grocery spenders in the developed world, and the pressure to always buy fresh is quietly making that worse. You buy it with good intentions, it wilts by Wednesday, and you throw out $15 in produce while feeling bad about both your budget and the compost bin. The frozen aisle has been solving that problem quietly for years. No mist machines, no warm lighting engineered to make cabbage look alive. Just product, sitting behind a freezer door, not asking for your admiration. And what's inside those doors in 2025, at Costco Canada, Walmart Canada, and Real Canadian Superstore, is not the frozen food that earned its bad reputation decades ago. Not the grey, mushy vegetables, the sodium-packed trays, the rubbery fish portions microwaved without enthusiasm. The category has evolved, and specific brands available right now in Canadian stores are, by measurable standards of nutrition, flavor, and practical value, genuinely outperforming their fresh counterparts in ways most shoppers never consider. But this is where the assumption starts to collapse, because this isn't just about peas and corn. It's about fish, fruit, protein, and everyday staples, where frozen holds a structural advantage fresh simply cannot match. Let's start with fish, because fish is where the gap between perception and reality is widest, and where the stakes for your health and your wallet are both the highest. When you pick up a piece of fresh salmon at the fish counter at Real Canadian Superstore or Loblaws, there is a reasonable chance it was previously frozen. Not because the store is deceiving you, but because that is how most commercial fish reaches inland Canadian cities. Fish caught in the Pacific or the Atlantic is frozen at sea or at processing facilities, shipped to distributors, and then thawed for the display case. Calling it fresh is technically defensible, but it is not the full story. That fish has already been through one freeze cycle. Buying it fresh means buying it in its thawed state, with a narrower window before it needs to be cooked. Buying fish that was frozen and stayed frozen, and thawing it yourself the evening you cook, is often the fresher product by the time it hits your pan. This is where Highliner Foods becomes relevant. Highliner is a Nova Scotia-based company with over a century in seafood processing. Their frozen portions, available at Costco Canada, Walmart Canada and Superstore, are frozen close to the point of catch. When you thaw a high-liner wild-caught fillet at home, you are frequently working with a better piece of fish than what is sitting in the display case labeled fresh a few aisles over. The same logic applies to shrimp, almost universally. Virtually all commercially sold shrimp is frozen at sea. The fresh shrimp at the fish counter is thawed shrimp. Ocean Jewel, available at most major Canadian grocers, and the Kirkland Signature frozen shrimp at Costco consistently outperform fresh counter options on texture and value. Because they remain frozen throughout the supply chain and arrive in your kitchen intact without the degradation that comes from that intermediate thaw and display cycle. Now move to fruit. PC Organics frozen wild blueberries, the President's Choice line sold across Loblaws affiliated banners, are one of the better kept secrets in the Canadian grocery aisle. A bag of PC Organics frozen wild blueberries harvested in Canada is frequently cheaper than a fresh pint imported from Chile in January, and nutritionally stronger because they were frozen at peak harvest. The antioxidant content doesn't disappear in the freezer. Neither does the fiber or the flavor, which becomes obvious the first time you use them in oatmeal. Fresh blueberries in a Canadian winter are a compromise product. Frozen wild blueberries are not. Then there is Earthbound Farm Organic, frozen spinach and kale blends available at Costco, and select Superstore locations that hold their iron and vitamin K content at levels that fresh spinach sitting in a plastic clamshell in your fridge for 4 days cannot match. You buy fresh spinach, use a handful, and 3 days later the rest has become something you'd rather not describe. The frozen version removes that entirely. You use what you need, reseal the bag, and the rest stays nutritionally intact. And consider this. A large bag of Kirkland Signature frozen organic mixed berries at Costco Canada costs less than half the price of equivalent fresh berries at a standard Loblaws in February. You're not paying a premium for a worse product, you're paying less for a measurably better one. If this is already reshaping how you think about your weekly shop, subscribe. Because the next section covers the frozen brands Canadians are consistently underrating, and a few of them are going to genuinely surprise you. The next part is where it gets more uncomfortable, because this is no longer just about nutrition. It's about how the food industry has deliberately shaped the way you feel about frozen and why that emotional framing is costing you money every single time you go through a checkout. Think about how Canadian supermarkets are designed. Produce at the entrance, bakery smells pulling you toward the back, prepared foods positioned to catch you at 5:30 p.m. on a weeknight when your energy is lowest and your decision-making is most susceptible. Every element in the store is engineered to generate one feeling, freshness, and freshness has been sold as a moral value, a proxy for effort, health, and the kind of person you want to be. Fresh equals doing it right. Frozen equals shortcuts. That framing was built over decades, partly through deliberate marketing, partly because early frozen food genuinely was inferior. The TV dinner era did lasting reputational damage to the category, but the technology has advanced dramatically, and the emotional residue hasn't caught up. In 2025, you are still making purchasing decisions based partly on associations formed in 1987. Consider Bonduelle, a brand you've probably walked past in the frozen vegetable section at Provigo, Metro, or IGA without a second thought. Bonduelle processes vegetables including green beans, sweet corn, and edamame within hours of harvest, at facilities close to the growing regions. The cold chain from field to freezer remains unbroken. Their product quality, particularly for haricotsverts and whole kernel corn, consistently outperforms off-season fresh equivalents in both flavor and nutrient retention. The packaging is modest. It sits quietly in the freezer section, while the fresh alternative, shipped from a different continent, claims the premium shelf space and the premium price. Then there is Arctic Gardens, a Quebec-based brand with strong distribution across eastern Canada, particularly through Metro and IGA. Arctic Gardens has been processing vegetables from Canadian farms for decades. Their frozen peas and corn are household staples in Quebec in large part because the quality is real, grown in Canadian conditions, processed regionally, available all year at a price that doesn't penalize you for wanting vegetables in January. In a country where fresh peas in February are peas from California that spent a week in transit, buying Arctic Gardens is not the compromise choice. In a meaningful sense, it is the more locally connected one. Now move to protein, where the value gap becomes the most tangible for Canadian family budgets. Maple Leaf Foods has a frozen line, including seasoned chicken portions available at Walmart Canada and Real Canadian Superstore. Fresh chicken from the butcher case is sometimes superior, but for households that don't cook every single day, fresh chicken sitting in your fridge for 4 days creates a food safety decision you probably shouldn't be making casually. Frozen chicken, thawed as needed, eliminates that entirely. No Wednesday night dilemma. No guessing whether the package opened on Tuesday is still fine on Friday. Then there's Rana, the pasta brand with a prominent refrigerated presence at most Canadian grocers. What most shoppers don't know is that Rana also produces frozen pasta, and that freezing is actually a superior preservation method for high-moisture pasta beyond the first few days. The texture holds, the flavor holds, and it's available on your terms, not dictated by a countdown clock on a refrigerated package, slowly losing its window. The frozen aisle is not where compromise lives. It is where practicality quietly wins, week after week, meal after meal without asking for credit. And this is the detail most Canadian shoppers never notice. The brands doing it best have been on those shelves the entire time. The assumption just kept you from seeing them. The final part is the one that changes how you actually spend money. Because eventually this has to come back to your real weekly grocery run, the one where you're trying to feed your household without spending $400 at Loblaws by Wednesday. The one where you check the flyers before you leave, because $7 for a head of cauliflower feels genuinely offensive. The one where January arrives and the produce section fills with imported fruit that looks acceptable and tastes like refrigerated disappointment, and you pay for it anyway because fresh is the rule. The brands in Canada's frozen aisles offer a genuine recalibration of that experience, but only if you stop walking past those freezer doors carrying an assumption that was always more about marketing than reality. PC Blue Menu and No Name frozen vegetables, both across Loblaws affiliated banners at No Frills and Real Canadian Superstore, represent some of the strongest practical value in Canadian grocery right now. A 750-gram bag of No Name frozen mixed vegetables for under $3 is not a lesser product than the fresh equivalent you'd assemble from the produce section on a January afternoon. In fall and winter, when Canadian field vegetables aren't in season, it is frequently the better choice. Nutritionally, logistically, and in terms of food waste. You use what you need, seal the bag, and the rest stays frozen. Nothing goes soft on day 3. Nothing ends up in the bin on a Thursday. The Kirkland Signature frozen section at Costco Canada deserves full recognition in this conversation. The frozen wild-caught salmon portions, the organic mixed berry blends, the frozen edamame, the chicken. These are products that pass the quality standard most Canadians would accept without question from a fresh alternative at a price per gram that makes the Loblaws fresh equivalent look like a premium paid purely for store atmosphere. Buying a 2-kilogram bag of Kirkland frozen salmon and portioning it yourself at home is a move professional kitchens have understood for years. The fish was frozen close to catch. The supply chain is tighter. The value is not even close. The deeper reframe here is about what cooking well actually looks like for a Canadian household in 2025. You have a long commute from Pickering or Langley or Brossard. You have a family eating at staggered times on weeknights. You have inflation turning the produce section into a series of small financial negotiations every time you push a cart. The ideal of fresh-only cooking was always partly aspirational, built on a supply chain that looks very different in practice than it does under grocery store lighting. Using frozen blueberries in your oatmeal is not a shortcut. It is a nutritionally grounded habit that costs less and wastes nothing. Pulling a highliner fillet from your freezer is not settling. It's understanding how fish actually reaches a city 3,000 kilometers from the nearest ocean. Buying a bag of Bonduelle green beans and using it across 3 weeks without waste is not laziness. It is the smarter system, the one that serves your budget, your schedule, and your household without apology. You started with the belief that fresh is better. That belief felt like obvious common sense. It was reinforced every time you walked into a store designed specifically to make you feel that way, through the layout, the lighting, the mist, and the signage. But Fresh is a story the supply chain tells about itself. The real story, about what nutrient content actually survives transit, what reaches your pan in better condition, and what costs less while delivering more, is a story the frozen aisle has been telling quietly for years. The brands behind those freezer doors aren't asking you to lower your standards. They're asking you to update them.